Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you are. Thank you for joining us for this month's edition of IronNet Engage, where we talk about the top threats from last month. With us, we have two guests, one that you might recognize from previous editions, Peter, and then one new one, Brett Fitzpatrick. So before we start, I wanted to highlight a few things, right? This is our third webinar for this channel. There's a number of archived webinars from both, the three of us, some other IronNet thought leaders. So be sure to go check out our channel, and then click on some of the webinars that we've had done before, as well as check out, future webinars that might be of interest to you. Additionally, the Iron Lens report that we'll refer forward to in this conversation is attached as a free download for us. So anytime that you're curious about what we're talking about, go take a look at that, as well as some other resources for the webinar. With that, let's start with some introductions. My name is Oliver Wai, the Vice President of Product Marketing. I'm just the moderator here, and we'll pass it on to the two smart guys that do the most important stuff in our company. So let's start with you, Patrick. Sorry, Brett Fitzpatrick. Get to tell us about yourself and what you do.
How's it going? Yeah, so I'm Brett Fitzpatrick. I'm part of the Hunt Operations team in the SIAC department. And what I am, my job role is a threat hunter. So in my customers, I hunt on their networks and try to, find the bad guys. And previously, before being at IronNet for the past 3 years, I was studying at Rochester Institute of Technology.
And obviously, everybody knows me from before. My name is Peter Rydzynski, and I'm working on the Emerging Threats and Detection Research team.
Awesome. Hey, great to have you guys here again. So let's just dive right into it. So September was an interesting month. There's a lot going on. But I think what we'll start with on the top of the news is the Zerologon vulnerability that came out just a couple of weeks ago. A lot of interesting things about it. It seems like it was pretty risky from a rating perspective of CVE. So let's start with you, Brett. As a SIAC team lead, what can you give us some color about the threat, what it is, and just things that you might think about when people hear about the Zerologon vulnerability?
Yeah, of course. So this was definitely a big one. So back on September 11th in this past month, a security researcher from Secura put out a blog post that was outlining the Zerologon vulnerability. So back in August, during Microsoft's Patch Tuesday release, they put out this vulnerability that they patched, and it was basically that if the attacker exploited it, it could allow those attackers to hijack enterprise servers due to the NetLogin cryptographic weaknesses. So I'll let Peter get into some more details about the technical surroundings around the vulnerability.
Yeah, before I jump into that, I just want to stress the timeline on this. I think this is just another example of Microsoft learning and executing on vulnerability disclosures better. In the past, lots of these disclosures would come out and patches would be subsequently released after disclosure, things like that. They've really refined their process, and actually the workaround, it wasn't a full patch, but the first workaround was released prior to anybody ever being aware of this bug. So, they've definitely enhanced their processes to make sure that many servers are protected. And I think actually, funny enough, given the fact that this was so severe, and as Brett, you were just mentioning, you had full capability to domain root admin by just having network access on a network. That's humongous, and yet we still don't see the impact that you would expect given the critical nature of this bug, largely due to, in my guess, due to this enhanced patch process that Microsoft has really developed. So kudos to them for really nailing this. And to answer your question, Brett, more about the technicals here, Zerologon was actually named because of the all zeroed out IV initialization vector used in the NTLM logon process. And so when an Active Directory server receives any authentication requests, in this case, in MS NetLogon RPC, which facilitates any Active Directory service account changes and things like that, this process, this initialization vector was used. Again, being all zeroed out, this allowed attackers to very easily predict keys used and essentially attack that cryptographic process and essentially become domain admin. So again, with just simple network access to domain root admin is very scary. And so people, I think, took this seriously and either updated their servers quickly or have also limited exposure through other workarounds. So although we have seen some activity on this from the Iranians, where there was just a news article a couple days ago that indicated that Muddy Water, or Static Kitten, the APT group out of Iran, has been observed using this attack. I haven't really heard too much else besides that. So in my eyes, this is a pretty big win.
Great, that sounds awesome. And so Brett, as a SOC analyst, right, like you deal with all kinds of interesting, CVEs. So what goes through your mind as a defender, and how do you prepare against these potential 0 days or other attacks that you might not be thinking about?
Yeah, so it's funny. So I mean, first thing that comes to my mind is like that "this is fine" meme, because just the severity of the vulnerability. But on a more serious note, really what it goes back to is just one of those basic principles of security. And that's really what it goes down to, is just patching vulnerabilities on a timely basis. So when Microsoft put out this Patch Tuesday back in August, and then the report was subsequently released in September, and now we're seeing still up until this day in October that these the actors are still exploiting this vulnerability. I mean, that's almost 8 weeks now where defenders could have come in and patched their servers and put in mitigations in place so that they can prevent this attack from occurring in their network. So that's my next thing I'm looking towards after putting the patch in, make sure my customers are prevented that way, is what detections, what mitigations can we put in place so that if attackers are going to abuse this vulnerability, we're going to detect them and we can catch them in the act.
That's great. It's funny how Patch Tuesday is part of everyday vocabulary now, right? Like it just seems like it's a term you would never think about, even 15, 20 years ago. And so that's always great. So that's awesome, Brett. And so let me stick with you a little bit. It's not just that we do proactive cyber defense for a lot of our customers. We also produce a threat report on a monthly basis, and so your team has a big hand in that. So let us know, or at least if you can tell us, what are some of the highlights from last month of September, right? Like, what are some of the interesting things you might have seen? Are there anything that you want to highlight, from our customers' perspective, or I'm sorry, from what we've done for our customers on this webinar?
Yeah, definitely. So we had numerous indicators observed across the kill chain this past month. But most notably, we're going to go back to Microsoft again. And we saw a rise in phishing activity specifically targeted at Microsoft O365 accounts. So in the Iron Lens report, if you take a look, we shared 3 of those domains that we used in this campaign. So there's a lot to leverage when an attacker can gain and obtain access to a user's O365 account, whether that be using their email for more spear phishing campaigns within their network, trying to get access to, like, say, a network admin in their environment, or just browsing their OneDrive files and seeing if there's any sensitive information that they can gather and expel out of the environment.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and especially when everybody working from home, right? Everything's cloud-based, O365. I mean, it's already sort of cloud-based already, but just the whole new attack vector, it just seems like it's a new normal that we have to think about. So switching over to you, Peter, there's a lot of research that goes into some of these reports, and I'm just kind of curious, if you had some commentary on what goes into these research, right? Like, what do you typically look at? Things like that we can talk about with our audience here.
Definitely. Firstly, I'd plug our Twitter account, IronNetTR, on Twitter. We post regularly and try to highlight interesting phishing pages that we're detecting. These tweets do not constitute all of the detections that we have and all of the collections that we've done throughout a week, but they definitely are the most interesting ones that we've seen. But for this report, we'll obviously include all of the phishing links and other nefarious websites that are popping on the internet. This is largely your new domains and things like that. So we love to be able to contribute in that capacity. But obviously, we've heard of the rise of Emotet. I think we're going to talk about that in a couple minutes. But in this case, we were able to detonate a variety of Emotet samples and pull C2, as well as other domain and IP address indicators that are observed on the network, and include that in our reports as well. So that actually constitutes, surprisingly, some unique indicators as well. We would have thought that these would be caught by your larger cybersecurity companies that are doing the same things we are, but we actually found that many of the indicators we were observing were fairly unique and not known through OSINT or through even paid feeds that we subscribed to. So some of those are unique indicators that we've been observing through these malware detonations, as well as subsequent file downloads from Emotet. So we've noticed that it's been downloading TrickBot and all sorts of other second stage payloads and things. So we're also feeding those hashes and indicators back into the report as well.
Yeah, that's really awesome. I mean, it's really interesting that we see, you hear of like, these are like oldies but goodies, right? So Emotet, right? Some of the other malware families that, you know, they wax and wane. So sometimes you hear from the news, it kind of disappears for a couple quarters, and then all of a sudden they're back again, you know, with a vengeance. So Peter, tell us a little bit more about that. I mean, since we're on the subject, right? You know, what have you observed? And I know that there's a lot of good hands-on work, you know, that you guys done, and so, you know, do you have any other colors? Is there any particular reason why that it seems to be on the rise again compared to, you know, previous periods?
Yeah, it's difficult to guess as to why we're seeing such a pronounced increase in activity around Emotet currently. But I can tell you what we've observed, which is your standard delivery mechanisms through infected Word documents. These aren't anything super sophisticated necessarily, but we are seeing some new techniques applied, including like password protected Word docs and password protected archives, zipped files, as well as a new phishing sort of lure, if you will, that basically tricks users into enabling content, basically allowing that macro, that infected Word document, to run its macro by saying that the doc itself was created on Windows 10 mobile or an Android device, and to, you know, for compatibility reasons, you need to enable content and allow the, you know, document to run code. And so that's just nothing groundbreaking, but sort of a new technique, new twist on this that's largely, I think, tricking many users who are you know, ingrained in the, oh, don't enable macros. But now you're seeing just a slight twist on the lure that actually is remaining effective. And to the password protection, as I mentioned, this is largely, I think, due to they've included that largely due to the fact that there are many filters and things that enterprise networks are deploying. In this case, a password protected document cannot be analyzed unless that password is typed in. So any automated system that would go in and collect that binary, detonate it, see what happens prior to the email or phishing link being delivered to a user, that is no longer possible. And so anybody who doesn't have a super sophisticated email filtering system, those documents and files will likely get passed on through. I know at IronNet that doesn't occur for us because we've locked it down so strictly, but I don't think many environments can tolerate the impact to business if they were to just simply block every file that can't be you know, evaluated. They might block certain extensions and things like that, but they're not going to block everything that's password protected, if you will.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, and it's also interesting, right? Like, it's another oldie but goodie, right? Like the malicious file. It seems like, you know, it's been there from day one, since when email was basically well adopted, right? Like, it just seems like it just never. It's just variations of similar types of patterns that people target folks with, and people fall for at the same time. So that's fascinating. So to you, Brett, right? Like, you're on the other side of the coin. So, you know, a lot of the research that our DRT team does, you know, feeds into the SOC that you work in. And so tell us a little bit more about that relationship. You know, how some of the work that Peter and team does fits into, you know, your organization, and how you use that and other sources of information to kind of guide what you do on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, so yeah, definitely. So with Emotet, I just want to just hit on that same point that Peter was saying about, you know, Emotet's a loader, and it's used for establishing that initial foothold on target. So it's a loader, it's like more of a stripped down rat. You can have your basic capabilities, downloading, executing, uninstalling, you know, maybe updating the loader itself. But what we're going to gain from like research and reports that Peter puts out is getting that situational awareness of what the tactics, techniques, and procedures that the actors are really doing. So with Emotet recently, I thought was pretty interesting is that recent reporting suggests that they're actually selling and leasing their access to more sophisticated sophisticated actors. So generally when we see Emotet gain access onto an initial network, they're likely going to sell it on the dark web to someone who has a sophisticated reputation, but generally it's going to do it for more commodity and criminal activities. But lately, in recent reporting, we've been able to tie that activity back down to the Lazarus group, or APT38. So it should that kind of suggests that this threat actor is working more closely with sophisticated actors, and specifically state-sponsored organizations.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, about the blurring between state actors and criminals, and then there's a little bit of virtual cycle on the offensive side where they kind of keep working with each other. Yeah, there's a little bit of a plausible deniability. It's always something that's fascinating, and something that we keep an eye on. Staying on kind of crimeware, the slash state-sponsored activities. Ransomware seems to fall in that category, right? In terms of that can both be criminal activity as well as ways for state organizations to potentially gain additional funding for what they do. You hear a lot about ransomware but at least in this news cycle, there seems to be a pretty big news around Universal Health Services, particularly how it impacted some of the operations that they might have had. So let's start with you, Peter. I mean, ransomware as a category, it's always in the news, but this one seems to kind of hit home more, especially now that we're in COVID environments, right? Like the healthcare system is quite critical to our country and other countries in general. So tell us a little bit about that. Give us your thoughts about that before we pass it over to Brett to have him talk about the SOC side of things.
Sure. Yeah. What you're referring to is the Universal Health Services was hit with ransomware I think it was 2 weeks ago but nonetheless, it seems that this is another example of what looks like full domain compromise and ransomware coming afterwards. And this is, it's hard to find words to describe the type of person who attacks a hospital in this capacity at a time like this. And it's definitely very frustrating. And before I get into what actually happened there, I would mention that as a general theme for ransomware, I've said this before, and anyone who knows that knows me, I like cryptocurrency. I've invested some myself, but at the same time, I am fully aware of the role that cryptocurrency plays with regard to ransomware and cybersecurity. And ransomware has absolutely undeniably become the most impactful threat out there in my eyes. You can have data stolen, but now we're seeing ransomware operators steal data too and hold that hostage. So it just really is the ultimate breach in my eyes, and cryptocurrency plays a direct role in enabling ransomware payouts. And so I think that we need to have a long, hard thought about what we're doing with cryptocurrency and the benefits that we're seeing with that. But to get back to the topic at hand here, in this case, Universal Health Services, as we were talking about, was breached, and we did see full domain compromise. It was nice to see, at the very least, the National Guard cyber defense teams stepped in and helped. So it's a good example of public-private partnerships and using all of the resources available. I can actually attest to that myself. We assisted the New York Power Authority in an advanced persistent threat breach that they actually experienced. There's very similar stuff here, except that it wasn't ransomware. But the National Guard cyber response teams were great and of critical help during those breaches. So big shout out to them. But nonetheless, healthcare systems are again, something we really need to take a long, hard look at, given the nature of what devices and what artifacts are left in healthcare infrastructure, including old legacy hardware, very niche healthcare products that likely don't receive patches, low-level things that are running on embedded operating systems that, again, are not up to date, not necessarily continued development, things like that. And I think we need to kind of think about how we are securing healthcare systems, and COVID is just another reminder of the critical nature of these types of services and what can happen when we have a large breach like this.
Yeah, no, you bring up a good point, especially with both parts on healthcare systems, some of the systems that you wouldn't think that you had to secure, right? Just because it always was not networked in the past, as well as cryptocurrency, there's a lot of new innovation that happens out there, and in most cases, they're designed to benefit society as a whole, but always, there's always the one or two or a few individuals that think about the other side of things and take a good thing and unfortunately do not so great things with it, and so that's kind of a shame. So sticking with the concept of or just the ransomware threat in general, Brett, you help defend a lot of our customers against things like that. So what are some strategies that you guys do as part of the IronNet SOC to help our customers mitigate, manage, or be visible about potential ransomware threats against their organizations?
Yeah, 100%. So before I go into the strategies for detection of ransomware, definitely just want to say, my heart goes out to the victims of this specific attack, especially during a global pandemic and, what we're seeing in our country right now. It is definitely like heart-wrenching to see, a threat actor go out and, attack a organization as such. But to go into strategies, with our current data set, we're looking at a lot of the network traffic. We're likely not going to detect the specific ransomware actually infecting the files on the computer. But moreover, in the better part, in my opinion, we're going to detect everything that happens before. So if you think about before the ransomware even gets onto the endpoint, the phishing lure, the suspicious file download, and then these lateral movement that subsequently happens after the ransomware starts spreading throughout the network. We're going to detect all of that. So that's what we focus on, because once the ransomware gets on the network and it's it's wreaking havoc and it's encrypting people's files, it's going to start exfilling that data out as well, so that they can ransom whatever target they attacked. We want to make sure that does not even occur. So if we can focus on the phishing, the suspicious file downloads, lateral movement, and also tracking where that exfiltration occurs, then we can try to limit as much damage that's unleashed in that network.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense, right? Like it's the whole strategy of shifting left, doing all the little things up front, just so that you don't get to the actual impact type of activity, and so that's definitely great to hear. So ransomware, it's such an interesting topic, right? And there's a lot of research that goes behind that in terms of how it actually functions, how it performs, and it seems like Peter, IronNet has some research too, right? In particular, your team has been looking into that, and we'll have a technical blog come out or technical report come out in the coming weeks or so. Can you give us a little bit of preview of that, right? Like, what are you guys looking at? What are some commonalities that you can discern in ransomware, and how that might help defenders?
Absolutely. We've been fortunate enough to, obviously, we've been collecting for a long time, collecting a bunch of malicious files for a long time. We've actually been lucky enough to catch a variety of different ransomware samples in our collections. And so one of our malware analysts took it upon himself to evaluate sort of how a lot of these different varieties behave, and trying to basically come at the problem from a, let's look at all the avenues for not only detecting, preventing, and all of that, but like really stopping ransomware in general. So it's definitely quite a hefty blog post, because we were able to detonate, I believe, 6 different ransomware families. This includes actually Ryuk, which was what hit the Universal Health Services, as well as Maze, which everybody's familiar with, NetWalker, Snake, Wasted Locker, and a couple others. But basically, through this research, our team is attempting to propose a sort of a path forward for how to deal with ransomware, with a focus on a lot of the endpoint detections, as well as network indicators and things that we were able to observe through the detonations that we performed. So I don't want to give away too much, but it's definitely a beast of a report. There's a lot in there, a lot of good details. There's even some IOCs and actionable operational pieces of information. So definitely take a look out for that.
Yeah, that sounds great. And so our team does a lot of really good work. Our previous couple blogs on different malware techniques and things of that nature had by far the highest visibility and highest viewership, right? Even through the IronNet digital assets that are out there. And it's also interesting because a lot of times these also get repackaged and republished as part of open source threat intel. And so kudos to you guys, and for the audience out there, right? Like all this will I'll give you guys a shout out at IronNet TR, right? That you guys typically drop those out there. There's a lot of great research, and so if you subscribe to that. You'll get that right when it comes out. So kudos to you.
Thank you.
So Brett, lots of great research from our DRT team. In the past, right? Like it'd be easy to kind of share information with your Peter's office is not too far from the SIOC, and you guys can just kind of walk over and have a conversation. Nowadays, like how do you guys manage that sharing of information, and how do you take what they've done research now that everybody's sort of remote from each other, and how does that information filter into some of the defenses that you're putting up for our customers?
Yeah, so with our current defense set, whenever the IronNet threat detection research team does do any research and they gather IOCs or behaviors, that all gets funneled right back to the SIOC. So with our current Iron Defense stack, we produce threat intelligence rules, and that's basically just indicators on domains, IPs, anything that our research team finds interesting, and can tie back to a specific malware campaign or threat actor. That gets all fed back into our Iron Defense system. So those TIRs, whenever they are collected, they all get sent out to all of our customers, and then whenever there is network traffic to any of those indicators, it will produce an alert. But then also just on the research side, sure, the IOCs do provide a lot of value for us, but again, it's back to that situational awareness. So getting the understanding of what's the latest tactics, techniques, and procedures of these threat actors, and specifically when it comes to ransomware, what behaviors is it emulating? Because that's really what it comes down to is, when you're trying to detect ransomware, IOCs, they're likely to get burned. They're going to set up new infrastructure, new domains, new IPs, new servers. So understanding the behaviors and trying to put mitigations in place, and also make our analytics better to detect those behaviors, that will really help us in mitigating these threats in the future and be able to detect it.
Yeah, I'd like to jump in and actually foot stomp what Brett had just said there is, this doesn't always have to be a direct IOC or a tangible, threat intelligence indicator of compromise or something like that. A lot of the things that we collect, and ransomware isn't necessarily the best example, but through all of our detonations, we actually feed that not just to the operational teams, but we also feed that back to the analytics teams as well to make sure that we are creating, not only capturing and tagging the behaviors at hand that, like Brett mentioned, but also creating repeatable scenarios that we can use to train our analytics as well. So as these campaigns shift and change, we are maintaining, updating and maintaining our analytics alongside that by using the raw detonation data that we have, which helps us keep sharp and make sure that our analytics are not, catching things from 2015, but not from 2020, right?
Yeah, and that's great. It kind of reminds me, I did bio a long time ago, immunology and all of the other good stuff, and it just sounds, echoes a lot of, sort of the strategies, right? Like you can look for specific viruses or bacteria, or you can look at the pathways that they actually do, right? The behaviors that happens within the body. And it's just kind of interesting, that obviously I'm not in bio anymore, but how 25 years later, right? Some of that same concepts of, how things spread and how things sort of work with each other comes back to play in the digital world. So really interesting in that sense. Okay, so let's shift the gears a little bit. So there seems to be another really interesting piece, right? We talked about ransomware; that's pretty commonplace. There's also a new threat that that was announced in the last month. UEFI rootkit, right? Not UEFA football, but UEFI. That's the rootkits that most of our audience may not have heard about. So let's start with you, Peter. Tell us a little bit about that. Right, what that actually is from a technical perspective, as well as what the impact is for organizations out there.
Sure, UEFI is basically the successor to BIOS. It solves a lot of the security issues that the BIOS played, that were incurred by using a BIOS to load operating systems into memory. Basically, the UEFI is a unified extensible firmware interface, which essentially again, replaces all the functionality, but adds a lot of stringent checks and security, features to the actual loading of firmware onto the host. So in this case, obviously, we've heard of lots of BIOS rootkits. This is very desirable from an attacker's perspective because getting access to that stage allows you to do things that you wouldn't normally be able to do if you're running in user space on a host operating system. So many of the detection mechanisms that typical antiviruses are going to deploy are defeated by a rootkit like this. And so it's always fun for us to see something like this because it does represent not necessarily a hugely sophisticated threat, but it definitely represents a threat that needs to be paid attention to, because traditional defenses aren't necessarily going to stand up to something like this. In this case, the UEFI rootkit is dubbed Mosaic Regressor by Kaspersky, who were the group who detected this. Crazy enough, this particular rootkit was observed being leaked from hacking teams' suite of tools way back in the day. And this is just a modified version of it that we've seen co-opted by, this threat group. And so it kind of brings up some questions about the ethics of red team tools, POCs, hacking services that are out there that deliver just raw, malicious tools, and sort of what they need to do to either defang or control access to some of these exploits, because this is just an example. It's pretty impactful. And I don't want to put the blame at the feet of hacking team, but there is a point where you have to say, we need to do something about locking down dangerous tools like this that are being co-opted and used in live attacks. So.
Yeah, and it's really interesting, right? Like that's why, IronNet as a company, we talk about collective defense, right? Like as you can obviously see, there's a lot of, sharing of ideas on the offensive side, both willingly or unwillingly, or just things that just kind of get leaked out there where the attackers will take, really novel concepts, that are very effective and tweak them to their own usage. And so, for us as a company, right, beyond what Peter does from a research perspective, beyond what Brett does on an active defense side, there's really a need for all of us to kind of come together as or different organizations within the industry, sector, state, however grouping that you want to really share information in order to kind of keep up with all these threats. And so definitely something to think about. Now, let me shift it over to you, Brett. Right? Like there's, Peter described something that's really obscure and not something that you would see commonplace in or at least that you wouldn't expect it to see. So how does the SOC SOC teams think about threats like that, right? Like things that may not be part of your situational awareness, but just behaviors that might be a little bit strange. Like what do you like? How do you take that kind of insights or just in general like odd behaviors and what do you do with them?
Yeah, so from a threat hunting perspective, I'll be honest, it's a hard question because the threats are not trivial to detect, and the mitigation is fairly cumbersome. But the way my team and I prepare for something like this is by going and reviewing each of our customers' threat landscape and modeling these threats that we can prioritize what is important and likely to occur. Because this is an extremely sophisticated attack vector, which in many cases requires physical access to the system. So we can assume, in that case, if attackers go into these lengths for persistence, they're likely performing espionage or, they're definitely a well-funded organization. So for some of our customers, they are a target for this type of activity. So while we may not always see this sort of activity on like a daily basis, it's likely going to happen once, maybe just once a year. We definitely still take it seriously, and we try to ensure that there are mitigations in place so that our customers, can defend against these types of attacks.
And I'd like to just jump in and foot stomp like what you were saying there, Brett, is this is sophisticated, this is difficult to detect, but once the actual subsequent malware is loaded, this UEFI rootkit was, really only responsible for loading a bunch of different malware modules, the same as we've seen for any number of different loaders. Once we see that subsequent malware deployed, again, because of the rootkit, your traditional antiviruses aren't going to detect the host OS behaviors. And so it really, again, is another use case for network detection and response, because it's critical that you're paying attention. And if you take a look at the activities that were observed in this attack, all of the same behavioral elements are true, we're still seeing the same behaviors from the subsequent malware that was deployed, regardless of the fact that they're using a UEFI rootkit. And so, the standard detection mechanisms that we're deploying are successful against detecting an infection like this, where typical host-based antivirus isn't going to necessarily be as well equipped to deal with something like this. So network is really a critical piece of the security puzzle. Once you've locked down your hosts, which I concede is the most important thing, once you've done that, stepping in and taking a look and at least being able to see what's going on your network is that next most important step.
That's great, and it's also helpful to have such a diverse team like what you have, Peter, with some folks previously on the offensive side, right? Because like these are the guys that kind of dream up things that you might think like, well, this is a weird behavior, it's probably nothing, right? Those are the guys that have that sixth sense intuition, in terms of like that this might be something, an indicator of something more interesting than on. So sticking on the concept of things that are hard to detect on the host side. So Brett, there's another piece of research, right, that came out in the past weeks about malware that's fileless, right, which is not as exotic as the one that Peter mentioned, but kind of the same concept, right? That these are things that may not have as much big of a footprint to essentially allow your antivirus or some of the more traditional tools that tape to see. Can you talk a little bit about that? That threat that came out just a few weeks ago, and then give us some color around that.
Yeah, so Malwarebytes put out a great blog post detailing a new fileless attack they observed back in mid-September, and they call this latest campaign Kraken, which they find some attributes similar to the Vietnamese APT32 group. In this campaign, the actors compromised a website to deliver a malicious Word document after the user was phished. So that is definitely something we see with common APT groups, is they will compromise some website that maybe the users go to on a daily basis, or is not novel to their environment, and they'll use that to deliver a malicious Word document or some type of payload. So in this case, the document was bundled with a malicious macro that was leveraged a modified version of Cactus Torch, which is basically a VB script shellcode launcher that takes a specific binary and injects some shellcode into it. And that was used to perform the fileless attack. And then I'll let Peter fill in any other technical details to just fill in anything I missed out.
Yeah, I mean, this isn't novel. This isn't anything new. We've actually seen, I think, 2 other references of previous threats and malware leveraging this technique of using, fileless attacks, targeting specifically, in this case, the Windows error reporting service. It is standard process injection. Again, nothing crazy here, but it should still be mentioned that these types of evasive attacks are, again, just slightly more difficult to detect and require that extra attention. And going back to the use of Cactus Torch, I'd like to give a quick shout out to the MITRE group for tracking this type of thing, because that attribution back to APT32 out of Vietnam is virtually impossible without groups like MITRE tracking the usage of tools like Cactus Torch. And so, although we're unable to conclusively say who it was who did this, due to a couple other artifacts, including that one, and due to good open source reporting on what APT groups are leveraging, what techniques, we are able to start to look at that and even make predictions about what's going to happen next and what techniques they may leverage, given the fact that we've been able to attribute this to a group. So yeah, I was definitely excited to see that. But one thing I was a little let down by was that they didn't mention too much about the persistence persistence mechanism that was employed here. So that's how they keep the malware running upon a reboot. Given the fact that this is a memory resident piece of malware, I was acutely interested to find out how they would survive a reboot, but it didn't seem that they went into too many details on that. But overall, again, as Brett said, decent reporting here from Malwarebytes, and just another fun example of evasion techniques that attackers are using to hide from traditional defenses. Yeah,
that sounds super interesting, and quick point, like back to putting on my old bio hat again, right? Like it's interesting, like groups like MITRE that really look at potential reservoirs of threats, right? Like based off of APT groups. There's a huge parallel, right, in the bio world where you track animals and resources of viruses and pathogens and things like that, just to kind of predict, what might actually be the one that jumps species and then cause the next big pandemic. And it just seems like, kudos to organizations that does the painstaking work, of doing that research, and especially, where you hope that your research never has to be used, right? Out in the wild. The most ideal.
The best way I would describe it is that all of us in the tech field have been beaten into us. OSI model is so important, and it's really easy to overlook the basics here. And I kind of put MITRE back in the day when I was young and naive. I put the MITRE and the attack framework and sort of the tracking that they were doing. I put it into that category of like, yeah, it's interesting, but is it really actionable? Is that really, can you turn that into operational intelligence and decisions? And I'm super excited to see, they've been doing a lot of work for a long time, and it's really paying off now. And I really hope that we continue to look at threats that way and label things and track the threats. And again, going back to enabling us to predict actions, now that we know more about what's going on with a particular piece of malware or a particular threat, we can make predictions and be a little bit more proactive about defenses.
Yeah, and you're on spot on that. And just having somebody build a taxonomy and just a common language that we can all share and kind of look for patterns. It's a hard and thankless type of task at times, but it's great that once you see the results of that all of us can benefit. One last one before we kind of wrap things up. I think a lot of what we talked about really goes back to the point that sharing is caring, right? Especially in the cyber world. There's just a lot of things going on, right? And each month we have these kind of conversations. There's lots of threats that are out there that are variants of old threats. There's like new things that come out. The more that things can be shared together between different organizations, because you're never going to have all the people in the world, right, that can help you defend. What if we can just kind of leverage everybody's capabilities and work together? That's what we're trying to do at IronNet, and definitely it's something that we all on this webinar feel strongly about, and so it's something that I think we'll close with on that thought. Well, gentlemen, thank you for joining this webinar and being subject matter experts. It's always a great time to have a conversation, to do these takes. Definitely happy to have you guys here. Thank you again for doing all that you do for the company, our customers, and what General Alexander likes to say, for our country, right? As we share information with bigger and better organizations. And so, thanks again. So for everybody who joined our webinar, thank you for staying to the end. Once again, I'll repeat, a lot of the information that you've heard here can be found in the attachments below this screen on Bright Talk, as well as if you join us at IronNet.com, you'll see a lot of the similar thoughts and ideas, as well as on Twitter at IronNetTR, where Peter and team does a lot of their work and shares with the general public. So thank you, and we'll end this webinar. Thanks everybody, and have a good one.
Thanks, Oliver.
Yeah, thank you.